And welcome to the first Thursday program of 2025. The museum right now is pretty ripped up as we put in new exhibits. We have 3 or 4 rather major new exhibits that are being put together. The museum's also really been busy. We were involved in the Prancer Palooza, the celebration of the 35th anniversary of the release of the movie. Did a lot of work on that, and it was a nice event. Hold on, admitting one more person. But I want to introduce the presenters for tonight. Please do mute yourself if you hadn't already, because I'm going to let Zada and Cecil kind of take over the audio from here, and I'll be muting myself in a moment. Zada and Cecil are both, Zada Bellew and Cecil Wilson are both enrolled citizens of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi tribe. Zada is a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Her research explores Native American business history from the fur trade to casinos, so that covers a lot. She'll be set to defend her thesis come spring of 26. Cecil is the historic research specialist for the Pokagon Band Center of History and Culture. He works out of Dowagiac at the Pokagon Band headquarters there. His work involves an awful lot of educational outreach. I know he's given a presentation at the barn where my wife does a lot of programs, and she said it was great. I know this presentation is very good because it was a form of it was given at the Historical Society of Michigan annual conference in Benton Harbor a couple of months ago, and I saw it and thought this really would be of great interest and moment to the membership of the museum. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Cecil and Zada.
Bonjour, everybody. Zada Bellew and Dishnikas, Bode Wadmi and Down, Mina Pokagon and Yuk, Indabindagwas, Mako'o and Dodem, Raymond and Dochbia, Granger, Indiana, Adayan. So I just introduced myself in Bodwe Wadmimwen, the language of the Potawatomi. I said my name is Zada. I'm a member of the Bear Clan. I am originally from a small town called Raymond, Wisconsin, but now I call Granger and South Bend, Indiana, my home. I wanted to open by saying Chimigwech thank you so much to the Region of Three Oaks Museum for hosting Cecil and me today. Thank you also to Nick for inviting us to be part of your first Thursdays. I apologize on behalf of both Cecil and I. If you're a Notre Dame fan, we'll try to make this presentation short and sweet so you can get back to the game. If you're not a Notre Dame fan, Cecil and I would be glad to take more questions. We could stay on the call. We could any other thing than watch that game. But we're just so grateful to be here, and we're really looking forward to sharing what we've learned about Leopold Pokagon with your community.
Yeah, Buju, Cecil Wilson, and Dijnikas, Bodawad Miandel, Mashiki and Dodom, Bageganiniuk and Dimbindagwez, Bianchi and Dochbia, Historic Research Specialist Eja McChawian. So just like Zada, I said, hi, my name is Cecil Wilson. I am a Turtle Clan member of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. I am from Hartford, Michigan, and my job is Historic Research Specialist. I also want to say thank you as well for inviting us out. This is a very exciting opportunity, and I love getting to teach, the surrounding communities about our enriched history, share what we can. And if Zada wants to jump into it, I know she was able to find a cool document showing this isn't the first time that Pokagons have presented for Three Oaks.
Yeah, we did some digging, and Cecil and I found this museum article that was written 103 years ago. It was talking about Mr. Michael Williams, who was the secretary of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, who gave a talk at what was then called the Three Oaks Historical Society. So we couldn't find a picture from the event, but the man on the left highlighted in red, this is Michael B. Williams, an election around the same time that his talk was held. And so Cecil and I are hoping that whoever speaks from the Pokagon Band again at the Three Oaks History Museum or whatever it's called 100 years from now will choose a very flattering photo of Cecil and me to include in their PowerPoint or whatever they're using 100 years from now. So happy to continue this tradition between our communities.
Yeah, it's a really cool document we found there. It's nice to see how the past is kind of leading the way for the present and what we can do to further the information that we're sharing with everyone. So we can jump into it. So today's talk is all about this man, his life and his legacy. Leopold Pokagon, pictured on the right there, was the founder, the namesake of our tribe, the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi Indians. We're a federally recognized sovereign nation based in southwestern Michigan and northern Indiana. Though few people outside of southwestern Michigan have ever heard of him, we argue that Leopold Pokagon really matters to U.S. history much more than any of us have realized. Despite his significance to the local and national history, it has been almost 50 years since anyone has attempted to write a book about him. There could be several reasons for this, but it's probably because, as you guys will see as we get into this talk, that there are not a lot of resources or sources to tell his story. One of the biggest challenges of writing and talking about Leopold is that, to our knowledge, aside from the treaties and petitions he signed, he didn't leave behind any written records of his own. If he ever learned to read and write, and there is a very good possibility he did, despite what you might see in newspapers, which weren't always most flattering to the Native Americans in the areas anyways, his documents have not been preserved in any archives that we know of. Although all that we know about Pokagon comes either from the oral histories from our own families or written sources from the people who knew him or allegedly knew him. Again, a lot of newspaper sources claim to know a lot about our tribes when they really don't during his lifetime, or they wrote about him after he was gone, as in the case of a lot of books you might come across. In this talk, we're going to discuss what we know and what we don't about Pokagon's life and his legacy. We'll show you guys how to read and interpret the few sources we have about Leopold to tell a bigger story about Potawatomi and United States relations in the land we now call southwestern Michigan. And I'll pass it off to Zada.
Perfect. So we've organized this talk into 6 sections, but if the Notre Dame game takes a turn, we might have to no, I'm just kidding. The first talk is all about, the first section of the talk is all about becoming Potawatomi or Potawatomi, or how we came to be as a people. The second is about Pokagon's early life. The third about the village that he founded in 1821. The fourth section is about Indian removal and its effects on Pokagon people in the 1830s and after. Then we'll go over Pokagon's later life and end, of course, with a few remarks about his legacy, what his name and his history mean for us today as Pokagon people. We'll try to be as comprehensive as we can in 50 minutes, leaving plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions during the talk, please write them down, and we're looking forward to that discussion at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cecil to tell us about migration stories.
All right, so to begin with, we can't really talk about our migration stories unless we kind of briefly touch upon our creation stories as well. As far as the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi people go, or the greater Potawatomi, maybe Anishinaabe culture goes, the Great Lakes area has always been our homelands. These are where we were created by our creator, Gejemnado, way in the past at the dawn of creation, as well as being where we came back to be home. We do have several different creation stories as well. They kind of vary depending on where you were located at, where the Potawatomi tribe you were part of was located, as well as whatever your family believes or what their oral histories have told them throughout time. Some of these involve being raised out of Lake Michigan itself. We were molded out of the red clay at the bottom of the lake, as well as some animals with us to be companions. This one's really interesting to me because this one ties really closely to the Meskwaki people in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The word Meskwaki itself meaning people of the red clay. So it's a very similar creation story to them. We also have one about how we were raised out of, or we were placed down from a mountain in Wisconsin. This one would be more tied towards like our Forest County band or Hannahville tribe up in northern Michigan and Wisconsin. This one says that we were placed on Earth from a mountain that would eventually recede. So we assume that this had to have been a glacial mountain of some sort. And as we moved away from this initial place down, we went out east and then we moved back west. The mountains were gone. So we were waiting for Gejemnado or Nanabojo, which is a whole nother story, to come back and lead our people and to see that we are still here. Our third creation story, which ties very closely to us at the St. Joseph River Valley area, as well as the Miami people, is that we were raised out of the St. Joseph River itself. For us, that river was known as Sinajwanzibe, or place of the Rocky Crossing River. A lot to do with how rough it was before the dam was there to get through there in canoes. And it's very similar to the Lake Michigan one, where we were raised out of the soil, out of the earth, brought on this land, raised with companions to help name things and to migrate outward from where we were. So now that we talked a little bit about our creation story, we can talk a little bit about our migration as well. So at some point in time from when we were created up until roughly 1000 CE, we had migrated out eastward, up towards like the New Brunswick and Maine area, up and towards what would now be Canada, probably following along the St. Lawrence Seaway. Sometime between 1000 and 1500 CE, one of our prophets in the tribe, he had a message from Gajemendo, our creator again, that said we needed to move westward. We needed to move to where the food grows on the water. We now know that this is in reference to the wild rice that we use as a staple in a lot of our foods. It's very important to our diets. He was told to move westward because we were going to have some really rude neighbors moving in from the east. We now know that those were the Europeans coming across. It was a good assumption, at least, and it did help us through migration. If you guys look at this image that we have on the slide, this is the more modern interpretation of what our migration looked like. If you look up by the New Brunswick area, that's roughly where we started. We migrated again down the St. Lawrence Seaway, all the way into Canada, crossing over in New York, back into Michigan and Detroit, coming over across what would later be known as the Sauk Trail or the Detroit to Chicago Road, heading down towards southwest Michigan, and then stretching up into Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, all the regions that we would eventually consider our ancestral lands. Another cool thing to note about this migration map is that if you look at where all these little arrows break off, that it wasn't just the Potawatomi people that migrated. There were also other tribes with us. We will talk later about the two important tribes to us, the other two tribes of the Three Fires Confederacy. But there are also, like in Maine, you see some of the tribes break off. These might be the Passamaquoddy people. When you get into New York, you might see some of the Oneida, what would eventually become like the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy people break off. So it was a mass migration of people. It wasn't just the Potawatomi. And then when we move further into the future, because I'm going to try to speed up a little bit, I apologize. I kind of rattle on when I start talking. But we eventually migrated into southwest Michigan. And then in the 1600s, when we start to see these rude neighbors that we knew were coming, the rude Europeans coming across the ocean to us, we start to see some of the eastern tribes encroaching into our territories. I mentioned the Iroquois Confederacy just a minute ago. They were one of the biggest offenders when it comes to the people in the Great Lakes region. They eventually moved from New York, moving westward, and took over the entire area of Michigan, Ohio, and into Indiana. They were looking to monopolize the fur trade. Their first interactions came with, I believe, the British people coming across, and they saw that if they had the furs, that they could trade for these, for guns, resources, things that the other tribes didn't have. So it allowed them to be more efficient at what they did and be dominant. We eventually, when we got pushed out of the state, migrated up into northern Wisconsin with a lot of the other tribes in Miami, the Odawa, the Ottawa people, the Meskwaki people were up there, the Fox, the Sac people, a whole lot of tribes up in there. And it was up in northern Wisconsin that we have our first interactions with Europeans. We meet with some French Jesuits that traveled, I believe, down through the St. Lawrence Seaway across the Great Lakes. We see some of our first baptismal records through these French Jesuits in the late 1800s or late 1600s. Sorry, taking a breath. So the late 1600s, and it was through these relations with them and these baptisms, we kind of adopt some of the Catholic beliefs because they fit with a lot of what our tribe saw as our own religious beliefs, our own ceremonial traditions. We adopt them and we end up allying with the French, and they help us push the Iroquois eventually out of the state of Michigan.
Wonderful. So by the time the United States was founded in the late 1700s, the Potawatomi Nation controlled most of the southern coast of Lake Michigan. All of the land you see highlighted in red, those were our traditional homelands when the United States was established. So originally they stretched as far north as Green Bay, Wisconsin, as far south as Quincy, Illinois, as far east as Detroit, Michigan. And even though this was Potawatomi territory, the other parts of Michigan were controlled by our allies. And so on that part, we had a buffer with our relatives who included mostly Ojibwe and Odawa. And then Cecil will tell you more about our alliance with them.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, we kind of, so historically, we weren't always called the Potawatomi people. That was more as we started migrating westward and we started interacting with more Europeans and more tribes, and we split apart from the greater tribe. But at one point in time, we had been just one large group with the Odawa and the Ojibwe people, Odawa also being the Ottawa and the Ojibwe being the Chippewa, more modern names for them, or more European, more anglicized names for them than what we know them by. In this Three Fires Confederacy, which is what we would refer to ourselves after we split, but we still kept strong relations with each other, the Odawa people would be known as the keepers of the trade, and they would be like the middle brother in this relation. The Ojibwe were the older brothers, and they were the keepers of the traditions, which is why if you see a lot of writings and books written about Anishinaabe people or about like Great Lakes Indians, a lot of the cultures and traditions were kept more up north with the Ojibwe people, so they were able to pass on this knowledge in ways that some of the removed tribes weren't able to. And the Potawatomi, or the Potawatomi, as we know ourselves, were called the Keepers of the Fire. These different titles held important roles to our people when we would meet. For the Potawatomi people, we are Keepers of the Fire because we would do a lot of sacred fire keeping duties, which is a very important portion of any of our traditional gatherings, our traditional ceremonies. And we will pass on again.
Wonderful. Okay, so now let's talk about Leopold Pokagon's early life. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about that. I wish we had more, and we continue to learn more and more every day. But historians and community members believe that Leopold Pokagon was born in the mid-1770s, most likely 1775. We don't know who his biological parents were, but we do know that they were Ojibwe and Odawa. He was not born Potawatomi, which is fascinating and really interesting that one of the most important people in Potawatomi history was adopted into our community. He most likely grew up in northern Michigan near present-day L'Arbre-Croche or Harbor Springs, a place where many Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa were known to gather, travel, and trade with each other. When Pokagon was young, the Potawatomi found him walking alone in the woods near the St. Joseph River Valley, and Chief Topnaby, who Cecil's going to tell us about in a second, adopted him into his community. Pokagon was given the nickname Pokagon, meaning the rib, because he was found wearing a rib when he was adopted. Rib in our language also means to shield, and so this double word, the multi-meaning of that word, serves an important role in how we tell stories about Pokagon, because later on, as you'll see, he served in many ways as a shield for his community, like the rib shield the heart. He shielded our people from removal. And so this would come to define Pokagon's role in the years that followed. Because Pokagon was adopted, he had the power to choose his clan. So at the beginning of the talk, Cecil and I identified ourselves by our clans. We were born into our clans. We didn't choose our clan because we weren't adopted. Pokagon did choose his clan, and he chose a politically influential clan at the time. And so when it was time for him to choose his clan, he selected Gitchagumi, meaning the Great Lake Clan. Traditionally, the Gitchagumi clan had a lot of political influence within the community, and when he was adopted, his elders gave him the nickname Sakiwanik, meaning the man of the outlet. And then we'll tell you more about the people who raised him in the next slide.
There we go. I do want to say too that Zada mentioned a story about how Pokagon became Pokagon. With being found with a rib bone. I've also heard, which that is the most likely story we have. Again, this is a lot of oral history passed down. I also heard once upon a time that he gave the nickname Pokagon because of the way that, like ribs shield an inner body, he shielded his people from removal, which I think is a really cool sentiment to it, but it just doesn't line up correctly historically wise, because he had the name well before he ever became the leader that protected his people. But it's a really cool thought, as well as some rather gruesome stories from the War of 1812, which, again, are a lot of stories that the locals gave him for how he got his name, just to kind of drum up like distaste towards the Native Americans, because Pokagon was notably very peaceful as far as I've been aware of. So he most likely would not have taken place in any of the wars, let alone to the extent of why they say he got his name there. So just another cool little thing that's also something in our tribe that is discussed upon. So as Zada mentioned, Pokagon was adopted into the tribe. He was adopted by a man named Topnaby, or Dokmabe, as we know him. His name Dokmabe means he who sits quietly. Dokmabe also gets represented with a bear a lot. I'm not sure why that is what happens to him, but he is imaged on the left here. He would be the adopted father of Pokagon, as well as the actual father, I believe, of Pokagon's future wife, Kittis. Zada can probably correct me on that. I'm pretty sure I'm right, but I'm not sure on the family lines there. But he was once known as the principal chief of the St. Joseph River Valley Potawatomi. As I mentioned, we weren't always Pokagon band. Before the Pokagon band, we were known primarily as the St. Joseph River Valley Potawatomi, and this would not just include what would become the Pokagon, but all of the tribes, all the Potawatomi tribes that resided around the St. Joseph River Valley area. So he was the principal chief. When the government would come and negotiate with our people, or even, newsletters and historical records from that time period, a lot of them just talk about Topnabi being the primary negotiator or the primary talker for our people, as well as there are a lot of areas in Michigan itself that took his name. I believe there's even a city up north somewhere that's called Topnabi, which makes no sense because as far as we're aware, he never went up to that area, but they just adopted his name to name a city after him. Topnabi was the son of Nanakiba, or Quivering Tail, in Katabwe. Nanakiba was also a tribal leader before Topnabi was. He was the tribal leader during a lot of like the fur wars and everything in the early 1700s, where I think also our tribal leader during the 7 Years' War as well, and then possibly leading up towards Pontiac's Rebellion as well. He would have been our principal chief of the region. Nanakiba was much more of a warlike leader as well. Topnabi is the first one that we'll talk about in the series of tribal leaders that really adopted a more peaceful stance. He saw a way to negotiate for our future rather than fight against it, and saw, because of what happened throughout his life, that fighting against him wasn't always the best way to go about it. And a lot of times that resulted in us losing more than what we had before. His peacefulness was actually very controversial to a lot of the chiefs in the region during the 1700s. Most notably, his own brother, a man named Shabazz, who was very warlike. And if anyone's ever heard of like Chief Five Metals or a Chief Little Turtle, Shabazz was very tight with them, and they were very aggressive and warlike. They took part in the War of 1812. I'll talk about the Treaty of Greenville. They took part in the battle before the Treaty of Greenville, which is how we ended up being included in it. A lot of stuff like that. And then also notably post-Treaty of Greenville, he fell out of favor really quickly with a man named Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee leader at the time. Tecumseh and his prophet brother Tenskwatawa, who eventually led what would become the War of 1812 in this region. They tried to enlist a lot of Native Americans, and because of Topnabi's peaceful actions instead of his warlike, aggressive demeanor, they just did not get along. Notably, Tecumseh was not a fan of Topnabi. But he was Pokagon's adopted father, and we'll move on to the Treaty of Greenville. I'll cover this section as well. The Treaty of Greenville was the first major treaty that the Potawatomi people were a part of. This one was primarily signed by Topnabi, again, as the principal leader of the St. Joseph River Valley, but we also see names like Five Metals and Shabazz and several other leaders throughout this area that sign it. The Treaty of Greenville takes place directly after what would later become known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. If you look at the imagery on here, you can see British and Native Americans, but also you can see some like tree stumps and knocked over trees. It's called the Battle of Fallen Timbers because the battle literally took place the day after a giant windstorm came through and knocked over a bunch of trees. This battle took place just westward of what would be later known as, or what would become known as Toledo, Ohio. So right there, like just south of Detroit. So not very far out of what would become Michigan territory. The Battle of Fallen Timbers was fought between the French and the French and the Native Americans against the British people as well. This was one of the last battles we had with them. My bad. I apologize there. Between the British and Native Americans against the American forces that were encroaching into here. The Native American forces had allied with the British because despite a lot of our like wars that happened against them in the earlier 1700s, we still saw them preferable over the Americans that were moving in and taking our land. This battle was fought with the American general was a man named General Mad Anthony Wayne. He is who the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana is named after, as well as Wayne State University in Detroit. It was a rout for the British and the Native Americans. It was a complete disaster. Anthony Wayne was a great general, really good at what he did. He was a terrible man for Native Americans, but great at what he did as a general. So they routed him. The British fall back first. They go back to their fort where the whole plan was that they were going to go back, fortify it, get it ready, the Native Americans would hold back the Americans, and they would just kind of like hold them back and then fall back and go into the fort, and they would kind of hold a siege against it, hoping that their defensible position would help them. This is not what happened. When the Native Americans made their way back to the fort, the British had locked it down, and they pretty much said, you guys are on your own. We just got handily beaten. If we keep fighting with this, it's just not going to go our way. It's going to make things worse for us. So they left the Native Americans out there to be captured by the Americans. Throughout this capture, and then later into 1795, to make peace with the whole situation, we see the Treaty of Greenville being signed. This Treaty of Greenville, as you guys can see here, would give away a majority of like the southwestern portion of Ohio, as well as a little bit in the northeastern portion. It would give away a lot of land around Detroit, a lot of land around Chicago, and then a big chunk of land around Vincennes, which was a blossoming Catholic diocese there, one of the biggest in the region. This treaty would also be notable because at this treaty, we would see that or this is the treaty that would directly lead to Tecumseh being aggressive against the Americans. Because even though you can't see it in this map here, like this whole section of land ceded away, it wasn't just a giant block of land. Throughout the whole region, there would be little dots of a Native American reservation set aside. So Tecumseh saw that even though him and his people got to stay where they weren't allowed to go anywhere outside of that without being mistreated or being against what they'd ceded away. So this would lead to Tecumseh being aggressive. He would not like what the Americans were doing. He saw that them taking this land was very much against what we as Native Americans held dear, that if we didn't fight back, it was going to cause us to lose everything. So he proceeded to go forward, rally up a lot of the Native American leaders around there, and try to force through what would become the War of 1812 eventually with his death. But I'll pass it on to Zada for the next portion.
Okay, so we're throwing a lot of stuff at you. I guess the summary of what this moment is right before 1821 is for Pokagon and his relatives, they are experiencing warfare, violence, dispossession at rates their ancestors couldn't have possibly believed. From the 1795 Treaty of Greenville onward, they ceded millions of acres of land to the United States. They lost loved ones to disease, warfare, and worse. I apologize, 2 days into the new year, we have a very sad story to tell you. But this was the world that raised Pokagon and his people. And so I'm going to turn now to one of the most important treaties to the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, and that is the 1821 Treaty of Chicago. And then Cecil, if you could press that button for me. Thank you. Okay, so the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, not a lot of people have heard about it, but this was an agreement signed between the United States and the Three Fires Confederacy. So you see here highlighted in red, we see the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations gathered together to negotiate for land and annuity payments. The reason why the United States invited them to Chicago is because one of the primary negotiators, Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass, said that it was easier for people to cede land that they could not see with their own eyes. And so this treaty was negotiated hundreds of miles away from the St. Joseph River Valley, and yet the St. Joseph River was at stake in this treaty. At the treaty agreement, the United States had come bearing gifts for the Potawatomi. The Americans offered us a deal. In exchange for their, quote, uncultivated land, which included extensive property in the land that was the St. Joseph River Valley, that appeared to the Americans to be of little use to the Potawatomi, Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass promised the Potawatomi Nation something more valuable than land. I don't know about you, but I don't know of many things that are more valuable than land. But what Lewis Cass promised us were annuity payments. And so Cecil Wilson mentioned earlier, the Potawatomi were dominant in the fur trade. The fur trade continued in the 1800s, but by the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, the Americans wanted us out of the fur trade market. Instead of participating in the fur trade market, they wanted us to transition our economy into more of an annuity-based process that was largely controlled, almost entirely controlled by the Americans. And so in exchange for 4 million acres of land near present-day southwestern Michigan and northern Indiana, which Cecil, if you could click that next slide. Okay, so this blue L-shaped land you see highlighted on the screen, this was all the land ceded at the 1821 Treaty of Chicago. In exchange for this land, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and Odawa were promised annuity payments for the next 25 years, as well as a teacher to educate our people and a blacksmith so that we could participate in the local economy. In reaching this agreement, according to my research that I'm doing for the dissertation, neither the Potawatomi nor the United States could have realized that this would result in one of the largest Potawatomi, and according to my research, one of the wealthiest Potawatomi communities in early more recorded American history. At the Treaty of Chicago in 1821 is where we see the beginnings of Pokagon's village. And so Cecil, if you could click that slide again. Pokagon's village is very difficult to see on a map unless you're zoomed in. And so here's that land cession highlighted in red. And then I've zoomed in even closer. And if you squint hard, you can see right on the Michigan-Indiana border, this very, very, very small reservation was Pokagon's village. It was, so in exchange for this land, the Americans got 4 million acres and we got a series of very small reservations scattered throughout this region. And so any of the red that you see highlighted here is unceded by 1821. But shortly after Congress ratified the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, a new Potawatomi reservation known as Pokagon's Village begins to appear in American records. Cecil, if you could click the next slide. Thank you. So Pokagon's Village was located near present-day Niles, Michigan, near several waterways, as the people on this call know very well, on the southern coast of Lake Michigan. This land provided everything for our people, everything that we needed to survive, and it's no wonder why, when given the option to choose, Pokagon decided to establish his village here. But the Potawatomi weren't the only people who found this land appealing. In 1817, an American military officer considered the St. Joseph River Valley to be a fine prospect for the United States due to its vast forests of valuable timber and exceedingly rich soil. That quote is included on this slide. In fact, that same officer claimed that neither China nor Holland ever had such natural advantages for inland water communications as did the St. Joseph River Valley. And then on the next slide, yes, for a brief moment, all roads led to Pokagon Village. Originally, it was located along the Chicago Road, which connected Detroit with Chicago, and later at its intersection with the Michigan Road, which connected Indianapolis to Grand Rapids. So on that intersection, this Potawatomi community had greater access to trade goods and agricultural supplies relative to more remote Potawatomi villages, or those who weren't located at this intersection. We might think this geography was a product of luck or being at the right place at the right time, but this was strategic. According to historian Ben Secunda, the Potawatomi helped establish the Michigan Road to facilitate more traffic to our people, which brought additional goods and services to Pokagon's village. I imagine Pokagon thought that this new location and more traffic would bring travelers and traders to and through his reservation without taking up residency within it. When American negotiators arrived to this region in the 1820s, oh, sorry, Cecil, could you press the next slide? Yes, they encountered an unexpectedly large number of Potawatomi. In 1828, an American surveyor estimated that at least 400 or 500 people called this land their home. So this image that you see on the screen is one of the most important images that we have when talking about Pokagon's village. And it might not seem like a lot, but I'll talk you through what this image is and what it tells us about our people. And so in 1821, Lewis Cass asked for a man by the name of E. Reed to conduct a survey of the St. Joseph River Valley to see who was there and what lands they were on. So in this survey, he's included a map. And it's kind of difficult to read, but down is north and up is south. Here's the Chicago Road right next to Pokagon's village. Here's the Indiana state line. And then of course the Michigan state line. Then we see several Potawatomi villages identified by name. Pokagon's is by far the most expansive, with 55 residents calling it its home. And so this to us is a testament to Pokagon's ability to serve a variety of Potawatomi people to help them survive and to serve the needs of the community. According to the surveyor, the estimate of the number of Indians living at each of the villages was far too low. It's most likely that he took this survey during the summer when we would have been off hunting and trading and probably up north. And so he put his best guess, but he estimated that no less than 400 or 500 indigenous people planted their corn here and called this land their home. So this wasn't a wilderness. This wasn't devoid of people or civilization. This was a thriving community by the time the Americans arrived in 1828. Right? Cecil, could you go to the next slide? So what happened at Pokagon's village is largely a product of a US policy called civilization. And so a lot of people don't know that this policy took place, but between 1819 and 1830, the Americans attempted to live side by side with their Native American relatives by offering them what a lot of 19th century authors will refer to as the gift of civilization. So what civilization meant by that time was anyone's guess, but it most often looked like living in largely agricultural homesteads with a nuclear family, not in wigwams, not in birch bark canoes, learning about Christianity and how to read and write and do arithmetic. And so one of the biggest funders of this civilization program was the federal government. And so that's how we see a lot of these processes taking place. I can see that we're telling you hundreds of years of stories in less than an hour, and we're running out of time quickly. So I'm going to skip ahead. Cecil, if you could. So here, this is a great image to stop at. So we see the effects of the civilization policy and its transformation on Potawatomi communities in sketches such as this. And so we can see that the Potawatomi, this is a sketch of a Potawatomi village in southwestern Michigan. And we see a more modern Euro-American log cabin next to a more traditional wigwam. And so we're adopting these Euro-American housing structures. We're fencing in our land. We're trying to use the Americans' understandings of civilization to our advantage to hopefully continue to lead our people and exercise our sovereignty on our own land. And so Cecil, if you can hit the next slide. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about McCoy. And so Cecil mentioned that our first introduction with missionaries were French Jesuits in the 1600s. By the 1700s, they were largely gone. But in the early 1800s, around the time that Pokagon started his village, Reverend Isaac McCoy started a mission right down the road, or the stream, I guess, the St. Joseph River from Pokagon's village. And so Reverend McCoy served as the agent for Pokagon's village from its founding in 1821 up until 1830. He was a Baptist missionary. He, according to our oral history and the documents that we have from non-Potawatomi people, he wasn't the best person for our relatives. If we were to have an agent at all, we would have wanted that agent to be Catholic, because Pokagon and others at that time were already practicing Catholics. But when we attempted to invite a Catholic to mission in our land, they arrived too late to the treaty negotiation in order to establish that mission. And so instead, we were assigned a Baptist missionary largely against our wishes. And so we can only imagine the friction that occurred between a largely Catholic Potawatomi population and a Baptist missionary looking to establish a place for himself and his people in this Potawatomi land. There you can see Pokagon's village, and right down the St. Joseph River is the Caring Mission. And so they were practically neighbors with each other. Then we can, next slide. Oh yes, this single sentence alone gives us a great deal about the value that the Americans had on this land. Not just the Potawatomi valued this land, but according to this survey, Pokagon and his relatives were located on somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 acres of, quote, by far the most valuable land ever purchased by the government in Michigan. And so even this small reservation and the collection of communities that are here, they were located on valuable land, not just for our people, but for the Americans as well. And then next slide, please. All right. So during his brief moment on what the Americans called the most valuable land in the state of Michigan, Pokagon based on the records we have, was a little bit of a showboat. So this was a more modern sketch of Pokagon and his red wagon. He was known to settlers in the region as someone who often rode around in this very ornate and custom wagon, which settlers called his flaming red chariot. You'll have to use your imagination with us here because this absolutely does not look like much to us today. But in the early 19th century, this vehicle was the Cadillac of early modern transportation. And Pokagon was so memorable and so he had such an impact on local history that generations of Americans continued to write about him and his village long after both were gone. If Cecil, you could press the next slide. He makes an appearance in Johnny Appleseed of all places. So Johnny Appleseed is said to have known Chief Pokagon. They were friends. He often spent the night in Pokagon's village with his people, and in more than one study. Yeah, go ahead, Cecil. He even spoke to Pokagon in Bodeway-Wadmimwen, the Potawatomi language. And so I've heard of things being as American as Johnny Appleseed, but I haven't heard the same to be true of as American or as Potawatomi as Leopold Pokagon. Next slide, please. Okay. So a lot of the Americans argued that, okay, we'll cut this for time. People like Lewis Cass were advocates for removal because they argued it was in the best interest of Indians to remove them from their land because it seemed as though the Americans' attempt to civilize Indians was not working. And so if you could cut to the next slide. The Indian Removal Act passed in 1830 and it remained, go ahead on the next slide. Leopold Pokagon is probably most known for his persistent resistance of the Indian removal policy. And so the Indian Removal Act was passed in late May of 1830. On July 1st of 1830, so less than 2 months later, Leopold Pokagon and 4 unnamed companions, Cecil and I are trying to work on who those companions were, journeyed from their homes in southwestern Michigan to Detroit, Michigan. Their mission was simple. They wanted a visit with the Vicar General of the Detroit Archdiocese to beg the Vicar General to send them a Catholic priest to mission among their people. Pokagon argued that they were Catholic. They had always been Catholic, but Lewis Cass and his friend Isaac McCloy were advocating for removal, and Leopold Pokagon did not want to remove his people. And so at first, the Vicar General was lukewarm towards Pokagon. He wasn't sure if he was sincere or if this was in the best interest of the Catholic Church to reintroduce its mission into the St. Joseph River Valley. So to convince him of his sincerity, Pokagon got on his knees and recited the Pater, the Ave, the Credo, and God's commandments without faltering and without making the slightest mistake. Father Richard was so moved by that demonstration that he said, "My children, you will not be abandoned. We will send you a Catholic priest." Even though Pokagon had gotten the yes, he wanted to make certain that this arrangement between the Potawatomi, specifically his people, and the Catholic Church would remain forever. And so Pokagon said, if you could press the next slide, Cecil, "My father, tell me the truth. The black robe that you will send us will stay always with us, your children, or will he only be among us for some time? We want a black robe for always." Father Richard agreed. And it couldn't be more fitting that we're telling this story today on a playoff game of Notre Dame, because Father Richard sent a man named Father Baden in 1830. And by 1842, a man named Father Edward Sorin, who's largely considered the founder of Notre Dame, came to the land that became Notre Dame to found or to continue the Indian mission that his predecessors had started. So it's going to be more perfect of a serendipitous day. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this we don't have time to get into it, but if you'd like to learn more, I'd be happy to answer during the Q&A. This is a image from a baptismal register that took place when Father Baden, so the Catholic priest, who returned the land. This is evidence of Leopold Pokagon's baptism, his wife Elizabeth, or Getes, and then their children too. Next slide, please. We don't have time to get into this now, but if you could go to the next slide. So I told you a lot about the 1821 Treaty of Chicago. By 1833, after the Indian Removal Act had passed, the United States was no longer interested in civilizing Potawatomi people or ceding land in exchange for annuities. They wanted the Potawatomi out. And so again, they called the Three Fires Confederacy from their homes, largely in Michigan, to Chicago, because like I said, it's easier to cede land that you cannot see. They gave them two options. They could either cede their remaining homelands and remove west, or leave the treaty negotiation with no annuity payments or no deal at all. So they absolutely did not have a choice but to cede the remaining homelands. Of course, Pokagon was here. By this time, he was a very well-established chief. If you could press the next slide, Cecil. At the treaty negotiation, we have Pokagon's words documented, and he reportedly said, "You have, my fathers, asked us to sell our land to our great father. We do not know what land you want. We have small tracts of land. We do not know whether you want these small pieces or what lands. We wish to know which it is you want." And so, like I said, when we squinted really hard to see Pokagon's village, that was all the land that they had left, but that's what the United States wanted. According to George Porter, he replied to Pokagon by saying, "Besides this, you own small reservations at Pokagon Village and the village of Topnaby. These are the lands which your great father instructed us to buy from you." So not only did they want the millions of acres that they got out of this deal, but they also wanted Pokagon's own very small reservation as well. And so Cecil next slide. All right. And so we don't know how, but we know for certain that Pokagon refused to sign this agreement unless there was an amendment written for his people. So in order to cede his land and liquidate his small reservation, his people would not be removed west with the rest of the Potawatomi. Instead, it's written on an amendment to the 1833 Treaty of Chicago that on account of Leopold Pokagon and his people's religious creed, they would remain in Michigan. Originally, they were supposed to go to northern Michigan, but by the time they were set to remove there, that land had already been ceded in another treaty. And so the people purchased private property in present-day Silver Creek and reestablished themselves on privately owned and publicly taxed lands. And Cecil, maybe you could skip all the way to 1994. I am so sorry. If you'd like to talk about anything that we've mentioned here, the Q&A would be great, but maybe Cecil can end on a more positive note than removal.
Yeah. As Zada talked about, Leopold Pokagon's efforts are what allowed us to stay in Michigan and to retain a lot of the land that we once called our own, or at least a chunk of the land we called our ancestral lands. A lot of his actions back in the 1830s and 1820s and even 1840s at the beginning of it led the way for a lot of what would become the modern day, the current Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. After all the removals happened and after we see the Indian Wars in the 1860s, 1870s, we see that the government stripped away tribes' rights to be tribes. And it wasn't until 1934 that they allowed us to become our own sovereign nations again, instead of just being people living on reservations or being forcibly citizens or become forcibly citizens of the United States. The Pokagon Band, unfortunately, in 1934, were not able to become reaffirmed or to get our sovereignty. And it wasn't until 60 years later, on September 21st of 1994, that we actually attained reaffirmation. This was signed into law by Bill Clinton. It had been decades of work in the time before that on to getting this. But it was through these efforts of Leopold Pokagon. We didn't talk about him, Simon Pokagon, all the other leaders leading up until 1994 and where we are today that allowed us to have what we have now, to have this citizen base, to have this land base, to have these services that we can give to our people to help us survive and help us be more of who we are and who we really should be. I feel like that might be a good stopping point if we wanted to jump into, there's our further readings things. Into a Q&A section.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So if anybody does have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. I think we're a small enough group so that people won't trip over each other to do that. Fred, I see you unmuted. Does that mean you have a question?
Yeah, Laura does. So
Oh,
Zada, as a fellow Badger,
Oh,
I think I
on
heard you're doing your
Wisconsin.
study on Wisconsin. Can you tell us something? You skipped through a lot of things, some really
Yeah,
great
I'm
slides.
sorry.
Tell us one other thing tell us one other thing. My question will be, tell us one other thing that you think is really important that you glossed over quickly, but like one other thing that you'd like to point out to us, maybe going back a few slides.
Thank you so much for that question. And I apologize. Like Cecil and I, it's thousands of years of history that we're trying to get into 40 minutes, and we're doing our best. But yeah, I would say I think a lot of the stories that we hear and we tell about removal is that, oh, it was for their own good, or it was necessary in the way of progress, or it was these were uncivilized people and savage people who were living in poverty. When you look at the history of Pokagon Village, that's absolutely not true. We were exercising our sovereignty as a village. We were allocating resources to at least 55 people, according to survey, though it was probably a lot more relatives than that. We were thriving in our own community. And even when we only had a little bit of land left, the United States still came for that little land. And so it just, regardless of the rhetoric that was happening at that time to push through legislation like the Indian Removal Act, we see these things that do not look like they were when you look at the like on the ground, if that makes
It
sense.
doesn't add up, right? Like
Yes.
what you're finding in your research is clear that
No.
wasn't adding up to what was told. And we understand that. No, thank you. And thanks for speed dating through a bunch of that. It would be fascinating to have 2 hours of this rather than one, but for both of you for
Maybe
trying to keep on pace. That's my question. Go ahead.
maybe a part two. I don't know.
Okay, I've got a question. How have you managed to keep the language alive? It was wonderful hearing you both speak it.
So back in 2006, we actually lost our last first language speaker of Potawatomi. So it was a very rough time for us. We were very close to losing the language in totality. So sometime in the late 2000s, maybe the early 2010s, our tribe sent two tribal members, a man named Kyle Malat and a woman named, I'm blanking on her name. Carla Collins, thank you. They went up into our Forest County band in northern Wisconsin to learn from first language speakers of Potawatomi. So through their efforts, they lived there for, I think, 5 years. And then they came back down to Niles or Dowagiac, Michigan to further it on there. So a lot of my personal language acquisition came because before I was a historian at our Center of History and Culture, I worked at our Head Start, Zogbagon. So I can tell you my introduction and I can tell you what grapes and forks and what to sit down and shut up are. I can't do that, but that's my personal experience. But they have done a lot of classes and a lot of just a lot of work. I think they started releasing music videos recently. Kyle Malat will sing the pop culture songs in Potawatomi, and they're absolutely hilarious. I recommend looking them up because he's a great guy. He does not have a good singing voice. So it's so fun to listen to. But, that was my experience.
Okay. Have any of the universities taught the language? I'm thinking of my days at Michigan State, and they taught a dozen African languages, but I don't remember any native languages.
I know that at least the local one, Southwestern Michigan College, so a community college near us, they hosted a language, as well as Hartford Public Schools over in Hartford, Michigan, where one of our casinos and a large citizen base is. They had language classes. And I feel like Notre Dame's, we've been trying to push our way into Notre Dame to get classes for language out there. They've done, I believe someone said they did a different Native American language class out there. So we're hoping to piggyback off that and get out to Notre Dame at the very least.
Great.
I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about some of the stuff you skipped over. First of all, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but even though there was an exemption for the Pokagon band in the treaty, the government still tried to remove them, and they had to go into court. in a wonderful justice's name, Epaphroditus Ransom,
Yeah.
ruled against the government and said these people now own property, which they bought with the annuities, I guess, and then refused to kick them out. And then I also want you to talk a little about Simon Pokagon, because Leopold's son was a really interesting guy, rang the bell at the Chicago Day at the Chicago World's Fair, was very famous as a writer. So maybe you can go back over a little bit of that ground.
Definitely. Cecil, do you want to take Ransom and I'll take Simon?
Take Simon. All right, yeah. And so the 1833 treaty, our first post-removal treaty that we signed, that removed a lot of Native Americans in Indiana and Michigan, a lot of Potawatomi, didn't remove all of us, and it was slow to be enacted. It took several years to get ratified, and then there were issues with funds for them to be able to actually start the removal process. So in 1838, they did the first series of removals. We call it the Potawatomi Trail of Death. That was when we first went. That was a lot of the Indiana tribes got removed out west, but that left a lot of the tribes up in Michigan and just a handful of them down in Indiana. So in 1839 and then into 1840, they started pushing further to remove the tribes. This was done by the American government, specifically helmed by General Hugh Brady. He was not aware of the Pokagon band's exemption from removal. So when he came into Michigan to start the removal process, we were on the docket for him. And Leopold Pokagon knew that wasn't good, that we needed to do something about it. So from our records, he sojourned out to Detroit to try to find an ally out there. And it was through that process of going out there, meeting people, talking to them, that he was able to get a personal opinion from a written opinion from Justice Epaphroditus Ransom, as Nick said his name, really cool name. I do have, again, so this opinion came out in the 1840s. Record keeping wasn't the greatest. It's hard to find. So we have some oral histories from it. And the oral history that I've always held like close to myself, and I always thought that it was cool, comes from our old director at the Center of History and Culture, Marcus Winchester. And he said that in this letter that Justice Ransom wrote, that allegedly it says, if you ignore this letter and you attempt to remove that group of Potawatomi down there in Southwest Michigan, I will, at the expense of the United States, make the United States Army bring back every single Potawatomi person. Bring them back to Michigan and Indiana and sort out on the government's dime who is supposed to be in Michigan and who is not, to settle it straight. So I've always thought that was just a really cool letter there. I wish that I could see the actual note myself. But again, record keeping is not what it now is 180 years ago. So
Yeah. And then Simon Pokagon, it was Leopold Pokagon's son, and he was quite a character for his time. He was born in 1830, so the exact same year that the Indian Removal Act was passed. So he literally did not know a world where Indian removal was not possible. He lived until 1899, so just shy of the 1900s. But during his lifetime in 1893, he wrote and published a birch bark pamphlet titled The Red Man's Rebuke. It was also called The Red Man's Greeting. And researchers like Kelly Weisskopf out of Northwestern are trying to understand which one was published first and why. I have a feeling, and a lot of others agree, that the rebuke was published first and then the greeting after. So it's like a softer message. But on the first page, you can Google this. It's all online. But he writes, on behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you. And then he was writing at the World's Fair. So the Columbian World's Exposition. No sooner, we can go on. It's 16 pages. It's great. I highly recommend it. But if you'd like to learn more, another Pokagon citizen and scholar named Dr. Blair Morsaw recently published an edited volume called As Sacred to Us, which is about Simon Pokagon's birch bark stories in their context. And so in that, it's an edited volume with a lot of Pokagon voices included in that narrative. And it tells stories about Pokagon, his life, his works. And you can see some parallels between the strategies that Leopold used during his time and what Simon was trying to do during his time. And he's just a very fun character to research. I highly recommend spending 5 minutes with the man and his writings, because he's a trip. But
he was known as the Indian Longfellow, I believe, because of how eloquent his writing was as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, he got a lot of attention in the Chicago newspapers. He was a pretty famous fellow, at least there. I don't know how broadly, but
Yeah. Yep.
Anybody else have a question? So please do unmute and ask. If no one else does, I'll touch on one other thing. You mentioned the roads, the Chicago Road and the cross street that I can't remember the name of. But also, wasn't the Pokagon land really important because that portage between the rivers was the portage really basically between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi. Am I right about that?
Um, my knowledge of portages aren't great. I'm still learning. But based on the evidence that we have from boosters in the area who are looking to settle this area, the water was so important to water is life. Water is everything. It's the basis of all that we have and all that we will be. And so to have access to such an important water source as a small community was invaluable. Like it was everything. And there's no wonder why Pokagon chose to establish his village where he did and when he did. And so I'll have to do some more research I'll have to pick your brain, Nick, on portages and the like. But yeah, it's
okay. I will point out that in the messages, the chat, that a couple of links my sister Carol actually has posted to the Red Man's rebuke or greeting, depending on which version we're talking about, and also an app, a Potawatomi app, which I'm not even sure what it does yet because I haven't clicked on it. No, my about the portage is the Kankakee River is connected to the Mississippi, the St. Joseph River is connected to Lake Michigan. So that was the sort of land bridge between the two water systems, from what I know. Anyway, Cecil, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, sorry. No, you're fine. You're fine. I interrupted you while you're talking. As well as that Potawatomi Win app, if you guys use the Mango language app, which it has a broad variety of languages you can learn on there, that's the more modernly supported one that we use. The Potawatomi one, though, that was linked in the chat is really good. And that one's, it's got games on it. It's a pretty fun method to learn through as well. But the Mango one's really good about teaching sentence structure and actually understanding like the cadence and all the present, past tense, inanimate stuff. So it's a very complicated language too. So I apologize in advance if you try to learn it.
Here's how some of it sounds.
I mean,
now it's not working. Sorry.
oh,
No, that means it is small. That means it's on sale. There's a discount.
yeah. We're always looking for that. That's an important one for us.
Teresa, do you have a question? I see you're unmuted.
Zada, would you just repeat one more time the reference to the Indian Longfellow? What was the name of the book and what was his formal name as an author?
Yeah, so he was known as like in newspapers as the Indian Longfellow, but his name was Simon Pokagon and his book was The Red Man's Rebuke. He also published a novel posthumously, so 2 years after he died, a novel called The Queen of the Woods shows up. That's kind of a fever dream. If you're looking for a fun like temperance novel, that's worth a read. But in it, I guess the important thing in all of his writings, and this is something that comes up in As Sacred to Us, the new book that's out about him, is Simon Pokagon always took care to insert Potawatomi words or Ojibwe words, which is a similar language, wherever he could, and then to translate that into English. And so as you're reading, you'll read certain words in Potawatomi first, and then you'll get the English translation out of that. And so language preservation was also very important to him. And even though he probably spoke fluent Potawatomi, he knew that there could be a future where his relatives did not or could not. And so he planned for that future by translating the words that we needed when we needed it throughout those books. And so I highly recommend seeing that in action.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cecil and Zada, terrific job. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And yeah, there's a little applause going on some screens. That's good.
Thank you.
And I will just let the assembled members know that the next first Thursday, will be Suzanne Levy, who's sitting in front of the Three Oaks Library tonight, talking about her ancestor, Joshua Chatterson, who's an interesting and actually a fairly funny fellow, I think. So that'll be on the first Thursday of February, which I can't tell you exactly the date, but you can look that up. But again, thank you, Zada, Cecil. Thank you all for being here. Notre Dame did win. I guess I should put that in there for those who were aching to hear the result. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Very
I
much.
want to throw
Oh,
out real
some of
quick
your
before we
studies.
take off too, that if anybody's interested in learning more, being involved more with the Pokagon band, our powwows, which happen twice a year on Labor Day and Memorial Day weekend, are free and open to the public. Come out, you can hear drumming. I don't know if you guys can hear drumming in my background noise right now. They're out there doing it tonight, but really fun, really good time. You can even eat our food. It's wonderful. And you can talk to just about anybody out there and they will share what they know with you, as well as if you ever want a more formal thing, you can always stop by our Center of History and Culture, and either myself or our archivist, Jen Markison, we will be here and we can share anything you guys want to know.
Yeah, I'll back. I did go to the powwow a couple of years ago. It was really interesting and fun. So
Where,
I'll
Nick?
back up on that. Yeah.
Where is it?
Oh, in Dowagiac, Michigan. My bad. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how far away that is from Three Rivers, but probably pretty far.
Yeah, it's a half-hour drive maybe. So
But it's an all-day thing, so you can come out in the morning and hang out all day. And they do opening ceremony, or they do opening drumming and dancing there. It's a wonderful time. Highly recommend it.
When is
Memorial Day, Labor Day.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much.